Hi, everybody, and welcome back to Public History with Jake and Justin. I'm Justin Voidoffer here with my co-host and friend Jake Wynn. Say hi, Jake.
Hello.
We are back this week to discuss episodes 3 and 4 of the Apple TV Plus miniseries Manhunt, following the hunt for John Wilkes Booth in April 1865. This is episode 3, The Wolves Aren't Fleeing. So we're going to open up first. Jake, how you doing? How's been the week?
Oh, it's been good. It's been a little bit of a tiring one, but doing all right, and pretty excited to talk about these two episodes, episodes 3 and 4 of Manhunt, and there's lots to unpack here. And most of all, I'm excited to talk to our guest on the podcast this week to talk with us about Manhunt, some specific historical aspects of what we see in the show. So we're very excited to welcome Rich Condon to the show this week. Rich, how are you doing?
I'm doing well. Thank you guys for having me.
Yeah, so a little introduction to Rich Condon for those of you who don't know him or follow him on Twitter/X. Rich is a public historian who previously worked at Reconstruction Era National Historical Park in Beaufort, South Carolina. This is one of the nation's newest national parks and tells the story of emancipation and freedom in the Civil War and Reconstruction eras. Rich is also the founder of Civil War Pittsburgh, which, again, if you don't follow that on Facebook and Instagram, go do that immediately. And he's also a founding contributor, along with myself, to the Pennsylvania in the Civil War blog. This, I'll just let you know now, this will not be the last time that you hear Rich on this podcast. We'll be doing a lot more with Rich in the future because he is, I think, one of the most important people to talk to when it comes to kind of public history, when it interacts with things like Reconstruction in that era in our nation's history, and talking about some pretty heavy topics when it comes to public history. And we're going to talk about Reconstruction and how it's portrayed in Manhunt through this episode. So looking forward to that conversation. Before we get to that, we're going to do a quick synopsis of episodes 3 and 4 of Manhunt. And because we are learning as we go on this podcast, we're going to keep this a lot shorter than our first inaugural episode. So I'm going to aim to keep this synopsis pretty short so we can really dive into the discussion around the history that we see and what we think about these two particular episodes. So, in these two episodes, episodes 3 and 4, we see the plot thickening as Edwin Stanton, the Secretary of War, and the War Department expand their hunt for the conspirators in the Lincoln assassination, in this case, extending over international borders to Montreal, Canada. We also learn that the Confederates and Confederate sympathizers are fleeing for Europe and Mexico as the Confederacy collapses. We see a lot of Edwin Stanton interacting with the new president, Andrew Johnson, and we see their tense relationship growing worse as Andrew Johnson could truly care less about the legacy of Abraham Lincoln and especially his policies around Reconstruction. Down in Maryland, we see John Wilkes Booth and David Harold traveling through the Confederate underground through southern Maryland, attempting to get across the river, that being the Potomac, and into Virginia with the help of various guides and members of the Confederate underground. We see significant amount of story about Reconstruction and the impacts that the Civil War has had on Black life in America. The coming of emancipation, military service, and Reconstruction, bringing lots of opportunities for Black equality that we had not seen before the outbreak of the Civil War. But along with that comes a lot of challenges that we see these characters dealing with as well. We see this specifically through the lens of the character of Mary Sims in the household of Dr. Mudd. We'll talk more about her a little bit later. But we also see that in these episodes through the perspectives of Black soldiers that we see portrayed in this series serving in the United States Army. In episode 4, we learn about the ghosts of previous events and their potential impact on the Lincoln assassination as Stanton tries to piece things together. One being the infamous Dahlgren raid, which takes place during the Civil War, was an attempt for the U.S. Army's cavalry to raid the Confederate capital at Richmond and seize what they believed to be a lightly defended Confederate capital at Richmond. That raid failed spectacularly and gets the name of the Dahlgren raid because the one of the officers in charge is last name's Dahlgren, and he is felled by Confederate fire, and ultimately some papers in his possession fall into the hands of the Confederates. And those papers have things like, the potential details about a plot to kidnap or kill the Confederate President Jefferson Davis. We also learn in this episode about one of the first attempted terrorist attacks in U.S. history. This really did happen in late 1864. That's an ill-fated attempt to firebomb Manhattan. Numerous hotels in New York City are set on fire in one night, an attempt to burn Manhattan to the ground. That also fails spectacularly. We see a lot of the episode center around that. One of the most amazing scenes in this, we see Edwin and John Wilkes Booth on the night of that terror plot having quite an argument, trying to build out some character development with John Wilkes Booth to explain how he and his acting brothers kind of interact, and the fact that John Wilkes is a lesser star than his older brother Edwin. We also get some downright silly scenes with Edwin Stanton that we'll talk more about in just a bit, facing down this kind of evil character that we see in this George Sanders, who may or may not have connections to the Confederate Secret Service and business connections in New York and Montreal. I kind of portray him as a Confederate spy master here. We see guns drawn. We see Stanton getting attacked. We see Stanton traveling all over the place between Montreal and New York, as if they had modern air travel and not rickety old steam trains. And just for good measure, we also have a bizarre biological warfare scheme thrown in here, because why not? I think if we see in episodes 3 and 4 that, historical facts, who needs them when you're serving a story? So that's a pretty quick synopsis of what we see in episodes 3 and 4. Now I want to turn it over to Justin, kind of get into a little bit more of what we think about these two episodes. So, Justin, what did you think about episodes 3 and 4 of Manhunt?
Well, Jake, I just want to point out too, historical facts are guidelines. They're like guardrails, right? Like you can, who needs them? They're meant to be mucked up a little bit. But no, I mean, it's very easy to bash this show. It really is. I'm going to try to, everything that we talk about tonight, like there's going to be a lot of things that go wrong. I don't need to hash them out again. I laughed when you said modern air travel, because that's what I had written down as like, man, Stanton has so many frequent flyer miles after this. He better like give himself a vacation after they catch all the killers and everything. But anyway, I think the good stuff, I'm going to try to hunt the good stuff here. I think the redeeming part of this show, in spite of everything else that it portrays, is that it shows that the death of Lincoln had real impacts for thousands of freed men and women throughout the country. You see that through Mary Sims. You see that through his death, and all the promises that you have up until he dies kind of go away overnight with Andrew Johnson. And Andrew Johnson is the best cast character in this entire show. I know Jake and I talked about it before, but man, like they nailed that guy. They nailed the actor. They nailed him. They just nailed him as a terrible human being. Sorry to say that, but anyway, Stanton, while not everywhere as he's depicted, still had a crazy work ethic throughout the war. So if that's the lasting impact or lasting kind of connotation people have with Edwin Stanton after watching this show, then I'm glad, right? Like he's not going to, if the general American public, if you quiz anybody on the street after watching Manhunt and they said, oh yeah, Edwin Stanton, I remember he was like a very hard worker. Good. Okay. I'm glad that's what came out of it. But those are kind of my two thoughts. I know Jake and Rich have a lot more. Rich, this is your first time having you on. You could the first 4 episodes. How have you liked the show so far? What have been your opinions?
Yeah, so I am going to start first off by saying anything I say on this podcast, these are opinions of my own, because I know Jake had given my introduction, talked about my previous work at Reconstruction. What I say here, they are not reflections of the National Park Service nor the United States federal government. These are all opinions of my own about this show, Manhunt, and the history that it shares. I will say, without being out of the way, there's a lot of good and a lot of bad that, in my opinion, comes out of the show. And I've had quite a few people ask me, even after episode one, episode two, what are your thoughts on this? And it took me, probably until episode three to really form a solid opinion of how I feel about it. And much like you, Justin, I think, there are some good aspects and some bad aspects. The good ones being, you know, that this does kind of open the floor for conversation about the bigger story of Reconstruction. What's happening after the Civil War, what's happening after the assassination of Abraham Lincoln by John Wilkes Booth. Talks about things like the education of freed people, land ownership, black military service, you name it. And like you said, delves into even what the nation's going to be left with when Lincoln is dead and gone, and that is Andrew Johnson and Johnson's policies. I think one of the best lines, I think it's in episode three. He sits down with Edwin Stanton and says, "Explain Reconstruction to me, as if I were a schoolboy who's not very good at school." And I had to pause that when I was watching it because I was laughing so hard. I think that, like I said, opens the bigger story, and also kind of opens up the floor for the viewers, the audience, to kind of get a breakdown from Edwin Stanton, who's sitting right across from him, to explain what is Reconstruction supposed to be. And like you said, Johnson, of course, as we'll see, and as it plays out in history, will fail Reconstruction miserably. And of course, Congress will have to pick up the broken pieces. I would say the bad side of things aesthetically, especially for those of us who are really into 19th century material culture, sometimes can be lacking when it comes to some of the portrayals of soldiers, or I guess the thing that really got me probably from episode one was Edwin Stanton sans beard and glasses. In fact, I had to double check myself. I'm like, wait, am I missing something? Did he not have a beard in 1865? And have I been thinking this wrong thing this whole time? I still don't have an answer for that as to why he doesn't, have that kind of the signature beard and glasses, the signature look for Edwin Stanton. But aside from that, of course they take certain Hollywood liberties in the show as well, and I'm sure we'll talk about those in a little bit. But otherwise, I'm still, even four or five episodes in, I'm still kind of forming my opinion. I keep going back and forth on this.
Yeah, I think one of my favorite scenes, and favorite I use it loosely, is the infantry charge through the ruins of Richmond. Hey, symbolic, I guess, but it was like a slow motion. I don't even know how to describe it. Like it was, gosh, it was so hokey. I don't know why it was in there. It didn't to me serve a purpose. I don't know what symbolism they're trying to get there, but man, yeah, I don't know. Jake, I think me and you texted about that, on how like just weird that scene was, I guess, by being thrown in there.
Yeah, kind of silly. A little bit of like, I think it may have been Rich I was texting with about this as well. It's like, oh, what are we charging, guys? The Confederate capital fell a week ago, more than a week after that takes place. So it's like, why are we charging through the ruins with bayonets? Doesn't make a whole lot of sense.
And there's maybe 7 guys that are making the charge on the broken city of Richmond.
Yep.
Small but mighty, I guess.
That's really all you need. All you need. But yeah, I'm gonna do the same kind of same sort of thing that you have both kind of done, and talk about some of the good and some of the bad here that I see with these episodes. I will say that I made the mistake of rereading Manhunt, the James Swanson book that this series is based on, after watching these 2 episodes and before finishing the series, which I know the last episode's coming up here soon. I probably should have waited, because the book is so good, and this is so kind of bleh by comparison. But I'll start with the good. I think Anthony Boyle as Booth continues to be really great. He's vicious and full of himself, just as John Wilkes Booth really was. A very vain character. I think he embodies that very well. It's almost like wish we could see a little bit more of him in that terribly, in that terrible role. But that's taking a bad backseat to the kind of Stanton narrative that they're building in this show. I'll say again, happy to see Reconstruction kind of centered in this story in these episodes as well. And I'm also happy to see the kind of real events that I'm sure for a lot of viewers, hearing about the Dahlgren raid and about the plot to burn New York City. This is probably for most viewers, I would imagine, probably their first introduction to those two events, which are, especially the Dahlgren raid, play a direct role in the real events leading up to the Lincoln assassination, and really a kind of a turning point and really souring the Civil War, along with the enlistment of Black soldiers after the Emancipation Proclamation and the breakdown of transfer of prisoners during 1863 and 1864. The Dahlgren raid also plays a key role in that, where it's like the hard war kind of component comes in, and the fact that papers are going to be found. We hear a little bit about this, whether or not those are authentic papers. They discuss this in the series. That there's a plot to kidnap or kill Jefferson Davis if the Union cavalry takes the city of Richmond. And this is looked at as by some as kind of the genesis of what becomes a plot to kidnap Lincoln before the ultimate assassination plot is hatched. So I'm happy to see that these two real events are portrayed in the series, even if their portrayal is a little stilted and may not be exactly right. Just the fact that they're introducing that, I think, is pretty cool. I'm glad to see that. Now for the bad, I think that the Montreal plot that they're alleging is just dumb. It misses the point, and honestly, some of the best parts of the Swanson book, which is the manhunt component, the actual hunt for John Wilkes Booth, as opposed to this like chasing down of an illusory and not real plot across international borders. I don't understand why Edwin Stanton is going everywhere all the time. As we've already referenced, travel doesn't work like this. He does not have frequent flyer miles. Airplanes don't exist yet. So it doesn't make a whole lot of sense that he is able to travel as quickly as he does in this series between New York and Montreal. Continuing to portray him as this kind of one-man investigator at this point is also just kind of doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And I think they missed out on an opportunity to show the wider impact of the Lincoln assassination and even the manhunt itself and kind of the hysteria it creates across the country. I think that's an opportunity that they could have told that part of the story instead of going down this strange international kind of rabbit hole that has no bearing on the real events that took place. And part of that is this George Sanders plot line, which is, again, just really dumb. And Sanders is a bit player in that may or may not have had some connection to Confederate. He's a real person with ties to Montreal, may or may not have had some ties to some of those involved in the Lincoln assassination and the Confederate underground. But making him out to be this boogeyman just doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And then the whole scene with like guns being drawn between Stanton and Sanders and this biological warfare plot with smallpox, it's ludicrous to the point of like, really, why are we doing this? The real story is fascinating. Why are we taking this artistic license to this level? And I think that they made this story a lot more tangled, convoluted, and honestly far less compelling than the real life events that it is allegedly based on. So all that being said, I'll just share kind of a final thought that I thought was very well said. I was reading around at some other kind of historical, analysis of the show, and I came across Dave Taylor, who's kind of a public historian as well, blogger. He writes at LincolnConspirators.com. He's also reviewing these shows, and he relayed this in his review of episode 4. He says this. He says halfway through episode 4. He talks about his wife turning to him and saying, quote, "I've read Manhunt. This show is not based on the book Manhunt." And I just think that's just a really funny line, and I agree wholeheartedly with that. So those are my thoughts. So let's take a turn, and I'm going to throw it back to you, Justin.
Yeah. So with that, we brought on Rich because we have one. Rich is one of the smartest guys about the Civil War in the Civil War area that I know, which is always great. Always bring your smart friends to conversations, which is fun. And we wanted to kind of ask Rich a couple questions about the show and then also about how it kind of relates to Reconstruction and his experience studying that time period. So I guess, Rich, starting things off, how do you think this show will contribute to the public's understanding of Reconstruction? And then also, what do you think about the storyline of showing that through Mary Sims, who is a one of Samuel Mudd's hired servants at this point, because I guess she was free, but also her experience post freedom or post emancipation from Samuel Mudd.
So first off, I will say I'm probably not one of the smartest people you know, but thank you so much for that. I do have to say though, we were mentioning before our conversation here, I had talked with one of our friends recently, Jared Frederick, on his YouTube channel, Real History, about the Free State of Jones, and up until that point, really, I felt like Free State of Jones was probably one of the best, I guess, depictions of Reconstruction I'd seen on film so far. There's been a lot of different interpretations over time, but probably the most realistic in terms of discussing things like land redistribution, education, voting, black military service, you name it. But Manhunt kind of steps into this role as well. And like I'd said earlier, with as many faults as I do see in the show itself, what it does, I think, effectively is at least open the floor for conversation about these bigger themes of Reconstruction through various characters. You guys mentioned, Edwin Stanton, for example. He's this frequent flyer who somehow ends up in random places at random times and places where he never was or wasn't there at that time. He's, I think, used as or is used as a narrative device, as is Mary Sims, who you just mentioned as well. Mary Sims, in fact, is not even on the Samuel Mudd farm in 1865. She never encountered John Wilkes Booth when he's, beginning his run from the federal government. In fact, she, I want to say it was the summer of 1864 that she had left the Samuel Mudd farm after he had physically abused her, as I'm sure he had done many other times before. But she was not there. She did, however, end up testifying against Dr. Mudd in 1865, basically testifying against him, mentioning his association with the Confederate government, and conspiring against the United States government, committing treason essentially, and it ultimately will lead to his confinement to prison. Funny enough, Andrew Johnson is the one that will pardon him later on. But aside from that, Mary Sims also kind of is this serves as a narrative device to discuss things like education. We'll see. I want to say it's in episode 4 that she begins her career as a school teacher for freed people. Her herself had very little education, but she had sought out her own education while enslaved, and we kind of get little Easter eggs like that dropped in the earlier episodes that she had kind of taught herself how to read and how to write. And so she's sharing that with other freed people post emancipation. But another, I think, important part we should talk about is the fact that she is going to be offered land. And I'm sure we'll get into this later on, but if we look at William Tecumseh Sherman's Orders Number 15 in 1865, 40 acres, or as most people remember it, 40 acres and a mule. This kind of leans into that theme of land redistribution for formerly enslaved African Americans. So they're using Mary Sims to kind of cover these various themes of Reconstruction, with which I think they do fairly well.
Yeah, and I was gonna actually, that was another one of my follow-on questions was about that meeting. It's not in 3 and 4. I think it's in episode 5 that we see that depicted in Savannah. I was not familiar with that. I had always heard 40 acres and a mule, but is that, I guess, is from Savannah where Sherman will start to kind of spread what will become Reconstruction while the war is kind of finishing up? Or how does that relationship between Sherman and the beginnings of Reconstruction in the Low Country fuel the rest of the nation from there?
Yeah, so what I would back up just a second, because what Sherman does is basically take what has already happened in the South Carolina Sea Islands, basically the area between Charleston and Savannah, and he's expanding upon what's already been done for the last almost 4 years. These islands and the people who inhabited them, the people who were once enslaved on these islands, from the what's known as the Gullah Geechee community. Once the U.S. government established a foothold down there, once the U.S. military had driven out all the Confederate troops and all the white plantation owners from the islands, formerly enslaved people will begin to work for payment and actually be able to purchase land that would become theirs, and actually would become their descendants' land. It's really the first place in the nation where you're seeing, formerly enslaved African Americans having the opportunity to buy property they can call their own. Fast forwarding to 1865, once Sherman's army completes their march to the sea, around the city of Savannah, he's actually going to call a meeting at his headquarters in downtown Savannah, and he meets with various leaders from the Black community. Many of them also being leaders in the Black church, and basically is asking, what do you want? What's to kind of move this process of Reconstruction along, and ultimately, the simple answer is land. We want property. We want something to call our own, something that we can plant our roots on, and pass on to our children, our children's children. And so ultimately, that kind of culminates in General Orders number 15, and that basically is kind of laying the groundwork for 40 acres per family to be redistributed. Basically, this is all land that was confiscated by the U.S. government from people who had engaged in open rebellion against the federal government. And, that land is going to be parceled off, given to these people, basically spanning about 35 miles or so inland, between I want to say Wilmington, North Carolina, all the way to the northeastern part of Florida. And then you're kind of getting a little bit of a taste of that in that episode in particular. What's interesting is I believe they're actually filming in the actual house, or at least they filmed the exterior of it. Most of the filming was actually done in Savannah. But when I saw that part, I was floored. I was happy that they had paid that much attention to the detail of this momentous occasion.
It's funny to me because, yeah, like they are super detailed and they do a super good job in some things and then just fly off the rails in other things. So it's weird.
Yeah, I thought in that particular case, I mean, that's like I know a lot more attention has been drawn to to that occasion wrapped around 40 acres or 40 acres and a mule. So I'm glad they at least had put attention to detail in that as well. But kind of going back to Andrew Johnson, as we were discussing earlier, all that stuff that has basically the groundwork is laid in the South Carolina Sea Islands, or in Sherman's headquarters with leaders of the Black community in Savannah. All that's eventually going to be undone under the administration of President Andrew Johnson. He basically will dismantle this 40 acres and a mule rule, if you want to put it that way.
Yeah, that was going to be my question is, you talked a little bit about kind of that memeable moment of like, explain Reconstruction to me as though I were a school child who doesn't know anything. How do you feel that that Johnson is portrayed in Manhunt? Do you think this is an accurate portrayal? How do you feel about the way that they've framed the Johnson character?
I think that scene in particular, that memeable moment, is really a teaching moment for the audience. He's asking, tell me about Reconstruction. What is Reconstruction? Because really, I think until the last 5-10 years, a majority of Americans did not know what Reconstruction was. And of course, Edwin Stanton is sitting there across from him and says, "You want me to explain Reconstruction to you?" You know, Beyond that, I think Johnson does get a fair portrayal in this show as he acted post Lincoln. One of the things highlighted in this show is kind of the contentious relationship between Stanton and Johnson as well, and that will carry on for years after 1865, of course. But I think they portray Johnson kind of siding with, siding on, I guess, reconciliation over focusing on the core or sole cause of the Civil War, which ultimately is slavery and the abolishment of slavery. And Reconstruction is reestablishing society without the institution of slavery. And Stanton makes that very clear in the show, of course. But one of the things that Stanton kind of highlights too is the fact that Johnson is not delivering on these promises of Reconstruction. They make that very clear. I think they did a very good job of that. And of course, Johnson is elated, that the fact that he has these wealthy white Southerners, people he had despised most of his life, basically coming and groveling to his feet at the White House and having to pay, a fine to basically get back in his good graces. I think they highlight a lot of those things. They touch on a lot of those important themes. Sure, there's more things that could have been done well, but I think kind of at the essence of it, they do a pretty good job of highlighting the Johnson story as it should be told.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Rich. We'll leave the interview section here. Thank you for bringing your expertise to this, and we really appreciate you joining us to talk about Manhunt episodes 3 and 4. We're going to jump into our final segment now, which is what we call Postscript, which is a segment of the show where we kind of conclude things by sharing something from the last week, or in my case, a little bit longer of a time period than that, that we share something that's left an impression on us that we would like to share. So it could be a book, an article, a movie, an experience, something that's left a lasting impression on us. So I'm going to start with Justin. What is your postscript for this episode?
Yeah, so it is a book. If anybody is a baseball fan, I cannot highly recommend this book enough. It is called Why We Love Baseball, A History in 50 Moments by Joe Posnanski, who is a national writer and has written some other things too. I love this book because it's a history in 50 moments. He does a very good job of not saying the greatest moments or the most important moments. It's just a history of 50 moments and done. And he basically goes through and picks the 50, and there's more than 50 in there. I forget what the number actually is because he'll do some lists and stuff. But like my favorite one I've heard so far, and it's truly remarkable, and it's why I love baseball too. Baseball being the national pastime, gets its roots in the Civil War era, whole thing with, who founded baseball, that kind of stuff. I always associated baseball with the Civil War, and I think I love them both because of that. One of the greatest stories I've ever heard about baseball is a man named Gaylord Perry. He was a pitcher for the San Francisco Giants. In 1962, he is taking batting practice. He's playing for the Giants. I think he's in a different city at this point. He's taking batting practice, and a sports writer comes up to the manager of the team as he hits a ball to deep center and is just caught before the wall. And the sports writer asks the manager, "Hey, who's that? He seems like he's a pretty good bat." And the manager says, "Oh, that's Gaylord Perry." He basically sums up by saying, "Yeah, he'll hit a home run when we land a man on the moon." And he says that in 1962. Well, Gaylord Perry played from 1962 through, I think, even longer into the 80s. But from 1962 to 1969, he batted, I think, over hundreds of times. I can't remember the exact number. Did not hit a single home run. The first at bat Gaylord Perry gets up to in July of 1969, I think it was July 20th, the day of the Apollo 11 mission where it touched down. 20 minutes after Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin touched down on the moon, Gaylord Perry hits his first home run in Major League Baseball. So that quote that was said in 1962 remarkably comes true, and Gaylord Perry does hit his first home run after men land on the moon, 21 minutes after men land on the moon. And I think that is one of the best stories I have ever heard sports-wise. And it's just one of those things that, if somebody would write that into a script, you wouldn't believe it, but actually happened in real life. So that's why we love baseball. There's many more stories in there. Like I said, can't emphasize how great of a book that is. It's just a fun, enjoyable read if you love baseball. But that's my postscript. I'm going to send it over to Rich. Rich, first off, welcome to the postscript segment. What have you had, done, read, listened to this past week that you'd like to share?
Thank you so much, Justin. So this kind of actually goes back a little bit more than a week. I had spent last week in the National Archives. I had a few days off from work, so I hadn't been in a long time, and I've been doing working on a new project and pulling pension records for USCTs or United States colored troops who served during the Civil War, as well as widows' pensions. And one of these guys in particular, his name's Lemuel Butler, served in the 55th Massachusetts Infantry. And I was kind of led down this path researching his story because he actually had kind of two connections to this guy, and that he had served in the Department of the South, which would have been South Carolina, Georgia, Florida during the Civil War. So me formerly being a resident of Beaufort when I worked for Reconstruction, of course found this story interesting, but also the fact that he belonged to a Grand Army of the Republic post in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, my hometown, the Robert Gould Shaw Post 206. I kind of went down this research rabbit hole on Butler, and I kind of left it in the archives last week. I hadn't thought about it too much since, but on this past Monday, I actually had a appointment set up with Barbara Barksdale, who is the longtime caretaker and steward of Midland Cemetery, which is just outside of Harrisburg in Steelton, Pennsylvania. And it's a historically black cemetery. For a long time, it was overgrown. There was brush everywhere. And she had taken on this project in the early 1990s to clear it, to get signage established, and basically to make it a destination, and tell the stories of those buried there. So for something completely unrelated to Butler, I had this appointment set up to meet with her, and it was a great experience. We got there, my girlfriend and I, Kim, and met with Barbara, and it was like we had known each other for years, and this is the first time I had met her. We talked for hours about some of the people buried there and common interests, things like that. But as I was walking up to meet Barbara, whose stone do I pass within the first couple of feet of stepping in the cemetery but Lemuel Butler? And I kind of had chills, actually. I was like, this is really strange. Like, I did not realize this guy eventually ended up here in Steelton, Pennsylvania, nor out of all the places where he could be buried in that cemetery. Right there in Midland. So anyway, that story, along with many others in the last week, I've been kind of delving a little bit more into, and I guess that's been kind of my experience in the last week or so. That's really touched me. So I appreciate it.
Man, Rich, you always have like these just kind of crazy stories that happen to you. And amazing experiences like that. That's really incredible story. Thank you so much for sharing that with us and with the audience as well. So I'm gonna close out here with my postscript, which goes back a few weeks as well. It actually involves Rich as well, which is the experience of taking Mr. Rich Condon to his first ever NASCAR race in Richmond, Virginia. We went there a few weeks back, and went to two Civil War battlefields, Gaines Mill and Cold Harbor, before we went to the race. I know I enjoyed the day. Rich, I hope you liked your first NASCAR experience, and I do have to say that you pulled off the NASCAR vibe pretty perfectly with your outfit choice. There are photos on the internet to show that as well. So I just wanted to let you know that, Rich.
I really appreciate that. That was quite the experience. And 10 out of 10 would do it again.
I mean, you all picked a great race too. Holy cow. Yeah, I didn't even know you guys went to Richmond. I knew you were going to one, but yeah, that was a good race, surprisingly.
Yep. So this is this, NASCAR has become kind of a favorite thing of mine. I know Justin and I talk about it a lot. I've roped Rich into it. So that'll probably be the postscript a couple of times through the remainder of the season about other experiences there. So I just wanted to drop that in. So any other NASCAR fans or emerging NASCAR fans in the listenership, you're among fellow kindred spirits here on this pod. So
does that mean we're also going to recap Days of Thunder as a historical piece of work? I guess historical artwork.
Absolutely. I think that definitely needs to happen in the future, to do a little film review for some historic films, since that's now like 35 years old almost. So it's it's a piece of history in and of itself. So a favorite movie of mine for sure. All right. So we are going to leave it there. Thank you all for listening in this week. And thank you so much to Rich Condon for joining us on the show. If you are liking this podcast, be sure to subscribe wherever you're listening in for more episodes. And don't forget to give us a rating and review the show. That helps more people to find us. We want to have some good reviews out there, attract some more people to listen into these conversations. And if you are listening in over on YouTube, we're also uploading over there. You can give us a thumbs up, and please give us a comment with your thoughts on this episode or other episodes there as well. So in conclusion here, thank you again so much for listening, and we will catch you next time.